Welcome to day 2 of the Conference on Equality in the Asia Pacific, Progress and Challenges, which is jointly organised by the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions and the EOC. I'm Peter Redding, who is Legal Counsel at the EOC.
多謝大家出席由國家人權機構亞太論壇同香港平等機會委員會合辦嘅平等共融亞太區會議2018回顧與前瞻。我係大會司儀 Florence。
Today we're going to focus on issues of race equality and disability equality. So first of all, we will have presentations and then a panel on race. We'll then have a fireside chat with two wonderful inspirational leaders before lunch. And then in the afternoon, we'll have presentations and then a panel on issues relating to disability equality.
A very good morning to everyone and distinguished panelists, organizers, particularly Equal Opportunity Commission of Hong Kong and Asia Pacific Forum, friends and colleagues. We are living in a very interesting times where inequality stares at our face. Economic, political, and social inequality along with environmental inequality. So the first thing is inequality is multidimensional. It's not only economic. At the core of inequality is marginalization and discrimination. And hence, inequality is a human rights issue. It's an issue to do with freedom. Hence, inequality is deeply political. So inequality is a sign of unjust and unequal power relationships, beginning at our home, that's gender inequality, discrimination towards girl children, patriarchy, and then it spills out of our homes and it begins with social inequality. And the most evident form of social inequality is racial and ethnic inequality. I come from a country of 1.3 billion people. Out of that, 25% of the people are Dalits and Adivasis. The word Dalits means broken people. This comes from the Marathi language. It means broken grain. When you say broken people means the will, identity, freedom, and dignity and opportunity of those people are broken, crushed. So today, who are the people who are at the receiving end of maximum number of rape cases? In India, Dalits. Who are the people who, we have a president who is a Dalit. So this is called symbolic, affirmation. But who are the people who are the poorest in our country? Dalits. Who are the people who get displaced when every quote-unquote development program comes? Indigenous people. Our government will not call them indigenous people. We call them Adivasis, the first settlers. The story is not just in India. And in India, it is very particularly important because I said that, the race and caste, and this was a big debate anybody knows, in the International Conference on Racism in Durban. The race and caste merge in South Asia because it's a historical, systemic discrimination. So I just wanted to, go straight to my presentation with that sort of, it's very important to say what it is like. So racial inequality is not a technical stuff. It's not just about, statistics. It's about daily lives of subjective and objective conditions where you feel discriminated. You feel marginalized. You feel that your opportunities are crushed. So hence it's very important. So it's as I said, it's a discrimination based on race, opportunity for socio-economic advancement, access to good and service. Even this definition is not good enough because racial discrimination crushes your soul. It's much more than that. Those who are at the receiving end of discrimination knows. And at the core of racial inequality is also social inequality. But the point about it is social inequality perpetuates economic inequality. And social inequality and economic inequality perpetuates political inequality, including the language of politics and politics of language. So both, and this also has environmental stuff, because the rich will have their swimming pools and the poor will not have the drinking water. So and we have to realize that environmental inequality is a very important thing. So, and then really move from South Asia. South Asia, as I said, there is a historical marginalization, systemic marginalization. In India, for example, our constitution gives equal opportunity to everybody. It's fantastic, one of the best constitutions we have. You name it, we have it, right? But the cows in the book do not eat grass, right? If you write sugar on the paper, it doesn't, have the sweetness. So we have the fantastic constitution. We have a system, but a system actually encourages systemic discrimination. So the point about it is you can have law on your side, but the society not on your side. And it's the same with gender discrimination in the country. We have everything, which you may name it. But when you go home, if your wife do not wait with a cup of coffee, your feminism ends there. So there is this, the distinction between law, policies, and the people. I mean, you all know the racism and racist discrimination and International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, 1965. And in the racism conference in Durban, once sort of done that. I just wanted to straight go to the multiple contexts and space and types of discrimination on the basis of race. While in South Asia, this has 3 dimensions: Dalits, Adivasis, and ethnic minorities. So if you go to the Northeast India, ask a Naga, how do you feel it? They say equal, but not so equal. So we are all living sometimes in animal form. All are equal, but some are more equal than others. You go to Bangladesh, you ask somebody from Chittagong Hill Tract, or you ask the Bihari community living in Dhaka, or the Hindus there, how do they feel? 12%. They don't feel equal, right? And that's the trouble. When your Chief Justice, who has a name called Sinha, who happened to be Hindu, who has been shunted off overnight in a country, right? So what do you mean? What does it say? Then you go to Myanmar, and that I will say it is the most stunning case of discrimination and human rights violation on the face of earth today. It's in Asia. And then, you go to the other parts. Any country in this Asia Pacific has ethnic minorities. Be it Vietnam, be it, Bhutan, be it Thailand, and ethnic minorities are discriminated. So in Asia, it has to be racial and ethnic. Straight away go to New Zealand and Australia. What's the case of indigenous people? How does an Asian, an Indian, a Pakistani, Bangladeshi feel in Australia? Ask. And I face discrimination in the airports. So it's not, it's not just a theory, it's how you feel. It's deeply, that's what it is to do with the soul. So now, it will be a sin, political or moral sin, not to talk about Rohingyas. I mean, I'm just talking about the general stuff. Now, there are different numbers, but including the data, so 6,700 people are killed. Women are raped, mass graves. And how can we keep quiet when such injustice happens? And it has to have both racial and ethnic dimensions. And Amnesty International said how the military raped and abused Rohingya women. And this is to be even racism, inequality. Women suffers more than men. And it has a gender dimension. And that is the first, hate, politics of hate is on women and in the name of rape. Today, more than 1.3 million people are refugees. There's a refugee crisis. When that refugee crisis happens, all the newspaper and media talks about it, and then we forget about it. So unless we address it, when inequality comes, there is violence with it. Please don't forget it. So ethnic and racial sort of inequalities, just look at the case of Sri Lanka, one of the most beautiful countries, which was the best of human development index. But one systematic discrimination in the 1950s, considering Tamil people as second-class citizens, you know what happened. When inequality is connected with identity, that is violence just beginning to explode, killing people. And we know the tragedy of Sri Lanka. It should have been one of the richest countries in the region, but inequalities, racial inequalities and discrimination created. So the point I wanted to say is the racial inequality combined with political inequality and a sense of injustice create breeding ground of violence. Afghanistan is a classical example. The people suffered war, and that is inequality not only within the country, but between the countries, and the hegemony of the North over the West, over the rest. And that is also a sign of inequality. Let's talk about the political economy of race, political economy of colonialism, and political economy of war. All of them have racial dimension. Then if you really look at it, multicultural societies, take it Malaysia. I'm happy in Malaysia, an election happened differently this time. But if you go to Malaysia and ask an Indian or a Chinese, person of Chinese origin, they feel discriminated, right? And this needs to be, and this election was a bit of solace. And you go to any other country, and I wanted to talk about migration. Goes to West Asia, ask a Nepali or Bangladeshi or Filipino working there are domestic workers. So this is at the lowest rung of economic inequality, which has a racial dimension. So who are the manual laborers everywhere? Who are the people who, wash your clothes, clean your table? At the least, in India it's Dalit. In UK or Australia, often it's people of color. And this has a whole to do with migration because their economic inequality and social inequality come together. And then rights of indigenous people is an issue everywhere, and these are connected with the basic issues, the challenges, and with that I'm sort of summing up. The biggest challenge is, in some countries there are legal protection, but many countries there is no legal protection. So first, Rohingyas need equal citizenship. Treat them as equal human beings. So without that legal protection, repatriation is useless. Right? It's not about the land, it's about the right to live with dignity and equal citizenship. Lack of positive discrimination in many countries, saying that, this is what we do, God created them like that, we can't help it. That's old argument. Denial of citizenship. Marginalized in the national economy and politics. Another biggest problem about it is lack of data. When I was reading out and I was looking for one good article with empirical data and analysis. No, because this is an uncomfortable thing you put under the carpet. Almost all the governments are in self-denial, saying that we are not into it. And the last, not the least, is the shrinking democratic and civic space. When your freedom is constrained, when your human rights is constrained, when illiberal politics engulf you, right, and patriarchy stare at your face, what kind of human rights are you talking about? What kind of racial inequality are you talking about? We are living in a place where populist authoritarianism, illiberal politics, and authoritarianism is constraining freedom, human rights, justice, and dignity of people. And that's at the root of inequalities, and that's at the root of discrimination. And racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination is a sign of our own injustice, which we have imbibed in us. Right? So in a sense, it is an evil which needs to be exorcised from our own soul, our own policy, and our own politics, and our own nations. Unless we do it, we will be doing injustice to the future. Thank you very much.
We next have a speaker from Hong Kong who's going to talk about the situation of ethnic minorities and particularly education. And he is the perfect person to talk about that, as he is Mr. Stephen Fisher, the Director General of Hong Kong Oxfam. He was born and educated in Hong Kong, and he used to work for the Hong Kong government. And his last post, he was the Director of Social Welfare, so a very senior role within government. After his retirement, he's still been extremely busy. He was the chair of Hong Kong Unison, which is an NGO in Hong Kong working on race equality issues. And he's also a member of the Commission on Poverty. And most recently has returned to work as Director General of Oxfam. So can you please welcome Mr. Fisher?
I'm going to tell a story about Hong Kong. Well, in my day job, as part of my work, we do humanitarian and development work. And one of the main tasks we do is to help vulnerable communities in China and in Southeast Asia to do climate change adaptation projects. That is, to help them to deal with climate change and natural disasters. In my voluntary work, I do something very similar because I help South Asian communities in Hong Kong to do cultural change adaptation because of changes in Hong Kong. And of course, the change that I refer to is the transfer of sovereignty from the United Kingdom to China. This happened in 1997 when Hong Kong returned to China, and Hong Kong was reunited with China. Before 1997, under British administration, things were a little different. You could survive basically with English alone. You can sit for the civil service examinations. You pass those examinations mainly in English. You can also sit for a Chinese language examination, but you don't really need to pass that examination. So what happened is that you are proficient in English, you pass those examinations, you join the civil service. This is also true of the banks, the financial institutions, and other industries. So basically, it's English-based employment market. Of course, Chinese is also important. But then in those days, a lot of people are very proficient in English, and therefore you can survive without Chinese. This started to change after there was agreement between China and the United Kingdom that Hong Kong will return to China. So policies will change in Hong Kong. First of all, the civil service rules will change. Expatriates started to leave, or no more expatriates were recruited. And in fact, my friend, Kim Selkel, retired from the civil service last year. He was the last expatriates administrative officer in Hong Kong. He joined when he was 21. So at a very young age, and he was the last to retire from the civil service. So there are now no expatriate administrative officers in the government. There are a few police officers who are expatriates, but they were the last remaining batch of expatriate officers. And increasingly, Chinese is the official language and the dominant language. Before 1997, both English and Chinese were official languages, but then you can survive with English only, because there was an army of then called Chinese language officers who would translate everything from English into Chinese. That is, all documents or papers were originally drafted in English and translated in Chinese. Then later on, they changed the name of the rank to official languages officers. So sometimes they have to translate Chinese documents into English and English documents into Chinese. I don't know what happened to that army of official languages officers, but I think very few of them now remain because you need to be bilingual in the civil service, and increasingly all the papers are now drafted in Chinese. Well, I was the secretary to the Commission on Poverty when I was in the civil service. I drafted all my papers in English, and it was then translated in Chinese. After retirement, the government appointed me as a member of the Commission on Poverty as a private citizen. All the papers we receive are in Chinese. No English translation. All the meetings are conducted in Chinese. And therefore, basically, you can't survive in the civil service without Chinese. And in fact, very few non-Chinese have been recruited into the civil service after 1997. So what is the problem then? In Hong Kong, we have a significant number of ethnic communities, the largest being the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Nepalese, the Filipinos, Indonesians, and so on. Before 1997, they go into our public education system, learn the English language, go through an English medium education, graduated, enter university, mainly University of Hong Kong and some other universities, local universities, no problem at all, no problem not knowing Chinese. But then after 1997, this began to change. Now, I think the University of Hong Kong is the last bastion of an English medium university. In other universities, increasingly, there are courses taught entirely in Chinese. So if you don't know the language, you can't take that particular course. And this had a major impact on the labor market, on the employment market. In the past, you can survive not knowing Chinese. You can get employment in the commercial sector and so on. Increasingly, now you can't survive without Chinese. Okay, only the top echelons in the commercial world still survive with English only. That is, you work for the major banks, the major financial institutions, stockbrokers, investment banks, and so on. But then if you go lower down the totem pole, that is, if you are administrative staff, accounting staff, legal staff, then you need Chinese. And in fact, they will not employ you without Chinese. So what is the problem? The problem is that our ethnic communities, particularly the children and their parents, haven't really changed their mindset about education. They still hold on to the old thinking that English is more important and that they don't need to really learn Chinese to survive in Hong Kong, and that the policies in Hong Kong also don't help them with a bilingual education. In Hong Kong, we still have the so-called designated schools. Well, the designated schools in common language is really segregated schools. The government have a term for this type of school, which I can never remember because the title is so long, it's 22 words or 23 words. I never remember. But it says something like schools that take in a lot of non-Chinese students, but we have special measures to help them to learn Chinese. So something like that. But I never remember that name. But basically, they are designated schools or segregated schools. You have 95% or more from one ethnic community or from several ethnic communities, most of them non-Chinese speaking. So they go through some sort of a Chinese program. But then when they graduate, their level of Chinese still remain at a very low level. They don't take the general school leaving certificate examination. They take international examinations. For example, the advanced level examination in Chinese or the ordinary level Chinese examination, which is at a very low level. You barely speak Chinese on that, or pass in those subjects. So basically, they are not learning Chinese to survive. My advocacy work wants to achieve one very simple objective. And that objective is that we want to hold government to fulfill, to implement its own policy. Because the education policy in Hong Kong is that every child going through the public education system, at the end of the day, they sit for the diploma in secondary education examination, and in order to pass, they must have a pass in 4 subjects: English, Chinese, mathematics, and liberal studies. Our system are failing ethnic minority children because nearly all of them fail the Chinese language examination, and they do not pass the standard set by the government for all children in Hong Kong. So our advocacy work is to hold government to their policy that they must fulfill this. And we hope that the EOC and other NGOs in Hong Kong will continue to press government to fulfill the pledges they have made and to implement their own policy. Thank you very much.
We're now going to have another distinguished speaker from Hong Kong, who is Dr. Pooja Kapai, and she's going to talk about issues of racial equality in a legal context, but also from the perspective of women and girls who are ethnic minorities. And Dr. Kapai is an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong, professor of law, where she serves as the convener of the Women's Studies Research Centre, and her research expertise lies in equality law, minority rights, and children's rights. She was also, until recently, a member of our EOC Policy Research and Training Committee, and she has previously served on the Working Group of Education of Ethnic Minorities. She's won some amazing awards. I won't go through those, but it's a great pleasure for us to be able to have her speak today. So thank you, Pooja.
Distinguished guests, Dr. Chen, colleagues at the EOC, ladies and gentlemen, it really is an honor to be here, to be able to share some of my thoughts with you on the progress, or lack thereof, on racial discrimination and protection against it for racial minorities in Hong Kong. I'm going to spend the first half of my presentation, 5 minutes, on going through the provisions under our race discrimination ordinance, seeing that we haven't yet covered that. And then I'll spend the last 5 minutes of it going through examples of how the provisions impact particular communities, especially bringing into focus the situation of groups of ethnic minority women. So first of all, we have 4 anti-discrimination laws in Hong Kong on sex discrimination, family status discrimination, disability discrimination, and then the most recent one was the Race Discrimination Ordinance, which was enacted in 2008 and came into effect in 2009. The first thing that we noticed when the law was being drafted and discussed in the Legislative Council was that the provisions were not on par with the other anti-discrimination ordinances that Hong Kong has in its repertoire. So there are certain ways in which the Race Discrimination Ordinance itself actually fails to protect racial minorities to the same degree as it protects people on the basis of gender or disability or family status. So the question, of course, is very, I think, pertinent, particularly to the first presentation that we heard about, that somehow minority status on racial or identity grounds tends to create a vexing circumstance where hierarchies of power come into play, and they affect a broad range of realms in the lives of the people concerned. So the RDO describes that discrimination occurs if a person, on the ground of the race of that person, treats the other person less favorably than the discriminator, or applies a requirement or condition which the discriminator would apply equally to persons not of the same racial group as that other person, but the proportion of people who can comply with that requirement from one racial group would be considerably smaller than the proportion of persons not of that racial group who can comply with it. So it's very technical, very legal, but suffice it to say that, in essence, this is different in terms of its language from the provisions or the recommendations in the Third Convention, which has a much broader definition of race, and Hong Kong doesn't seem to follow that. So in Hong Kong, the meaning of race is defined as race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin of the person, but there are certain prohibited grounds which are not covered, as you can see here in the long list. For example, whether or not someone's a permanent resident here, or has or does not have the right of abode here, or has any sort of restrictions on their sort of conditions of stay, or the permission to land or remain in Hong Kong, their length of residence here, nationality, citizenship, or resident status. These are aspects that are not covered by the meaning of race. And there are various other sort of key provisions, which I won't go into. So the limitations then are really threefold. First of all, there's a very narrow definition of racial discrimination. Second, there are very broad exemptions, as you've just seen, on the meaning of race as a prohibited ground of discrimination. And then, of course, there's limitations on the scope of application, which I'll discuss in just a moment. So, on the narrow definition of race, if you compare with the UK Race Relations Act, it suggests that the ground would be racial grounds, which is broader than just the grounds of race. So, for example, on the ground of race may not cover people who are associated with the complainant on the basis of their race, whereas on racial grounds covers any reason for an action based on race, whether it's the race of the person who's affected by the action or the race of others. There are other examples as well, but we don't have time to go into those. On indirect discrimination, again, the definition just suggests that a person is subjected to a requirement or condition which the discriminator applies to them. However, in the UK and in particular sort of EU jurisprudence, we can see that there is a broader definition of sort of what kind of act would constitute discrimination. Any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference on grounds of race or on racial grounds within sort of the language of those laws, putting the persons of the same race as the complainant at a particular disadvantage. So we don't have to show discrimination or the exact impact, but showing that there's a particular disadvantage allows the claimant to pass a lower threshold to establish racial discrimination. And so all of these sort of limitations in the ordinance have made it very difficult for racial minorities in Hong Kong to bring claims, because there are great evidential burdens which they're unable to fulfill, because it's very hard to explain or identify exactly what factor affects the decision maker's decision towards them. And because we're talking about thoughts and reasons which may or may not be expressed, and certainly when we're talking about jobs or government law and policy which are internal, it's very difficult to identify the specific grounds on which certain acts were taken. And that evidence is not likely to be in the hands of claimants. So we can see that the Third Convention has a general recommendation which recommends a broader definition which has not been applied in Hong Kong. And the committee itself has also made observations regarding Hong Kong's sort of failure to include the broad grounds of prohibiting racial discrimination as part of its RDO. And it urged Hong Kong to extend the definition of racial discrimination, and particularly urged them to extend it to internal migrants as well from mainland China, and to stop the widespread discriminatory practices against them on the basis of their origin. Third, I mentioned that there's a limited scope of application of the ordinance. For example, the other ordinances expressly cover all government functions and powers. The RDO does not. And so there has been this question mark in the past decade whether government powers and functions are subjected to the ordinance. We had the opportunity to have this issue determined in a court case, the only court case that was brought before the courts under the RDO, which has been in effect for nearly 10 years now, where a young ethnic minority Sikh boy brought a claim of racial discrimination against the police in Hong Kong on the grounds that he called them for assistance when he had an altercation with a Chinese woman, but instead of the Chinese woman being sort of questioned, appropriately. He was questioned and arrested and then detained for a while by the police while they inquired. And also he was made to wait for 4 hours for an interpreter to interpret for him, even though he said he understands English very well. And the police insisted that he needs to stay for interpretation in a language called Indian. And he said, I don't know Indian. I don't speak Punjabi either, which is the dialect that they should have said they're waiting for him to receive interpretation in. And this case went to the district court, and the court's view was that even though he found the testimony of both the child and the mother credible in terms of the things that happened at the police station while he was detained, that because the police acts in arresting him and investigating him as the perpetrator of an offense do not amount to services for the purposes of the RDO, no discrimination was found. So law enforcement as a function or power is not expressly covered in the ordinance, and this case attests to the fact that there is a way to read the ordinance such that that power would not be construed as covered by the ordinance. The government has argued that, of course, people could use the Bill of Rights Ordinance, which has equality provisions and non-discrimination provisions, as well as the Basic Law, Article 25, which also has a guarantee to equality. But in this particular case, the claimant's legal team did not put these grounds to test. And so it remains to be seen whether combining the RDO with those alternative grounds would perhaps result in a different outcome in a case such as this. So this is the most recent observation in 2018 in August, where the committee asked the Hong Kong government to extend its coverage of the race discrimination to cover government functions and powers. So there are very limited remedies for victims in general. The EOC also has a limited set of powers only pertaining to these 4 anti-discrimination ordinances. It doesn't comply with the Paris Principles as a body, and a victim's only recourse, as was in the case of Arjun Singh, was that if they can't utilize the EOC procedures, for example, because government functions and powers are not covered, the EOC would not be able to take that case forward, then they would have to go to court independently, which is extremely costly, of course. So in light of sort of this background, specific challenges faced by ethnic minority women. So I want to highlight, for example, the plight of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong who come here on a very specialized visa where they have very restrictive conditions, and any breach effectively results in a criminal offense. They're also subjected to a live-in requirement where they have to live with their employers. And of course, we know from many, many studies that have been done recently and published widely that accommodations in which they are made to stay, even though the government, of course, requires employers to provide proper accommodation, their accommodations are less than adequate, in many cases actually inhuman and degrading conditions that they're subjected to. For example, the sleeping in toilets or in kitchens on top of cupboards or common areas where they're frequently disturbed, they don't have adequate privacy or even a proper rest between their days of work. They also are subjected to a 2-week rule where if their employment comes to an end or is ended prematurely, then they only have 2 weeks within which to make alternative arrangements and leave Hong Kong. This, of course, jeopardizes any source of access to justice if they have outstanding claims to make against their employer. Although they may file a claim, they have to then stay on in the territory on special sort of conditions of stay where they're not allowed to work at all, so they can't receive income, and a case may drag on. So oftentimes, many of them, because of this 2-week rule, decide not to pursue wages or other outstanding claims they may have against their employer. They're also excluded from minimum wage laws and the right of abode. So normally, a person staying in Hong Kong as a sort of general place of residence for a period of 7 years or more is entitled to apply for permanent resident status, but in the law, domestic workers are specifically excluded from allowing sort of their period of residence in Hong Kong to count towards the 7-year requirement, and there was a court case to this effect as well. So they're subjected to various forms of discrimination, but the question is, does the RDO in its framework sort of assist this kind of a group? No, it doesn't, because nationality-based discrimination, of course, is excluded, immigration is excluded, and these are all necessarily areas of policy which the government should and generally enjoys a wide sort of berth in terms of developing. But it is undoubted that given that most of Hong Kong's foreign domestic workers come from Indonesia and the Philippines, that there is a racial/nationality dimension to this, where the groups of women who are distinctly affected by this set of laws and conditions are disadvantaged by these economically, socially, and otherwise in terms of their personal human rights, and a number of gender-based discrimination as well, specifically on the basis, the impact, the particular disadvantage does fall on grounds of their race or nationality, and there's very little that they can do about it under the RDO. I just want to skip very quickly to this idea of intersectional discrimination. What we're really highlighting is that there are categories of people who, apart from having a racial identity, have several other identity markers which are a source of disadvantage depending on the jurisdiction they're in. And in Hong Kong, certainly, when you have a combination of racial minority status and a precarious immigration status where you either depend on your employer or you're depending on your husband to sponsor your sort of visa in Hong Kong, you're a religious minority and you have a lower socioeconomic status and you're a woman, these factors will impact your experiences of various forms of disadvantage and discrimination. And particularly egregious, of course, is the situation where women face gender-based violence. And again, the law and its general lack of impact and the low level of awareness in the community of the entitlements and the protections on grounds of race that the women are afforded, particularly language being a significant barrier. There are many ways in which these women, sit at the intersection of race, gender, and other marginal status, including poverty, and are not able to exercise or benefit from any of the protections that are afforded to them under the different sets of anti-discrimination laws, but also human rights laws and protections in general. And I want to highlight that intersectional discrimination is not sort of a double discrimination or additive discrimination. It's not adding layers of discrimination onto each other. The key is to understand that when a woman who is a minority on racial grounds and is, let's say, a victim of poverty and suffering from gender-based violence, her experience of discrimination or oppression under the system is unique by virtue of her having these multiple identities. And no other person is similarly situated to her simply by sharing her race. So an Indian woman, for example, experiencing violence would have a different experience to an Indian woman experiencing violence who doesn't have a permanent resident status in Hong Kong or comes from a lower socioeconomic background. And these are challenges that our race discrimination law does not cover, nor do our SDO or other anti-discrimination ordinances. And of course, globally, these are very challenging issues. But in the context of everything that the speakers before me have shared with you in terms of the regional situation and the crises, we can clearly see that there's a nexus between migration, violence, socioeconomic status and the economic realities in the region and who we depend on for our menial labor work and the prospects for equal human dignity to be realized for people of all races and backgrounds. Intersectional discrimination is something that we really have to think about and go beyond the categories of race. And that's one of the things that I want to leave us with, that law can do certain things, but there are certain things that the law is unable to do because we are so wedded to this notion of categorizing people, and if you fall within the category, then yes, you're protected. If you don't fall within it, then sorry, you're not. What of all those people whose circumstances are not adequately captured by the law or by the jurisprudence that we see emerging out of the courts or international treaty bodies? What good is a law where it doesn't match the realities, the lived realities of minorities on the ground? Thank you very much.